Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, March 7th, 2024. I'm Dr. Umonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for the Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. If you look to the panel interface on your right, labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for your best option. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on YouTube and the DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available for you to download in the webinar panel box along with today's agenda. Questions can be typed into the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and the team will review and respond during the open discussion session portion of today's webinar. We respectfully ask that you hold questions until that time. And now I'd like to introduce Deputy Secretary Marlena Hutchinson to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Marlena.
Thank you, Dr. Smalls. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our March Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. As you all know, this is our second meeting. We are very excited and anxious about getting into this work for this review cycle. Next slide, please. Today's agenda will start with the approval of the January meeting minutes, an update on membership, followed by a review of rate setting feedback submitted by Max and our response to those concerns. We'll also review the feedback received on the FY 2026 rate priorities and our next steps. Finally, we'll have an open discussion before closing. I'll now turn it over to Jennifer McLevain. Jennifer?
Good afternoon, everyone. Members of the REG were sent an email with meeting minutes on February 29th. Are there any corrections to the minutes that were distributed? Okay, hearing none, as co-chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, then the minutes are approved. Thank you. We'll then move on to the next slide, and I will turn it back to Marlena.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'd love to welcome our new REG members. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Following our last meeting, we requested that the REG members submit nominations for the 3 vacant seats. All nominations were reviewed and considered for selections that would ensure representation of a wide array of services and diverse stakeholders across the regions. So these are the individuals we've selected to serve. At this time, I would like for the members to please introduce themselves. So I'll start with David Irvin.
Next slide, Dr. Smalls.
Greetings, everyone. David Irvin. I work for Macomb. Some of you may recall us as JFGH. Delighted to be among you.
Welcome. Next, Chris Parks.
Hi, Chris Parks, LTSS Transition Specialist for Somerset Community Services, and happy to be back on the rate group.
Welcome. And Matt Rice.
Hello, everybody. Matt Rice, Executive Director of People on the Go Maryland. It's a pleasure to be back.
Welcome. Robert?
Thank you, Marlena. So last fall, Laura Howe was kind enough to share a slide deck with Secretary Herrera Scott that covers the CMS guidance on home and community-based services rate setting methodology. It also sheds light on Max's feedback regarding the BRIC methodology and how we've been implementing it here in Maryland. Plus, it includes some thoughtful recommendations for DDA. In the spirit of being completely transparent, I'm excited to share parts of this slide deck with all of RAG and our public attendees and go over some of Max's concerns. We'll take a look at those slides together and then discuss our thoughts and responses to the points raised. Next slide. This slide from Max presents rate setting objectives and federal and state requirements. Just going to give you all a few seconds to review the slide. Okay, next slide, please. So in our journey to refine the way we set rates for DDA services, a key slide in Max's deck brings to light the different paths we take for capitated and fee-for-service rate setting. Here's a little background to set the stage. Capitation rates require what's called actuarial soundness. This is a bit like making sure your financial bases are covered, ensuring that the rates set are robust enough to handle what's expected down the road. However, DDA services follows a fee-for-service model, which steps away from the need for actuarial soundness, leaning instead on guidelines from CMS. These guidelines aim to make sure payments reflect a balance of efficiency, economy, and quality of care. It's reassuring to see our current approach not only meets, but strives to exceed these expectations. Thanks to the thoughtful input from the RAG, we're in a continual state of refinement, fine-tuning our methodology to better serve our community. Every 5 years, there's a moment for reflection and review, a chance to look at our service payment methodologies and rates with fresh eyes. We're currently in the thick of this process, looking forward to a comprehensive update of our rates for FY 2027. Achieving this goal, however, relies on gathering accurate and detailed data from our providers through the general ledger template. This is a team effort, and your support in collecting high quality data from at least 80% of providers is crucial. As you recall, this data, completion of the general ledger data collection tool is mandatory for 100% of DDA providers. But in order for it to be useful, we need at least 80% of providers to complete the tool. This collective effort will ensure we accurately represent costs across various providers and regions. The slide also touches on Maryland's specific requirements, a legacy from the rate study conducted before the adoption of the BRIC methodology. As we pivot towards a more data-driven approach, the quality of data we receive from our providers becomes ever more critical. Sharing concerns raised by Max, particularly regarding appropriate wage levels, highlights another layer of our ongoing discussions. This concern ties directly to our priorities for this cycle, emphasizing the importance of collaboration, transparency, and continuous improvement in our shared mission. Next slide, please.
Hey, Robert, it's Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
Would you mind popping back? I've got a couple questions or clarifications on that particular slide.
Sure. If you all can hold your questions until I get through this segment of the
Okay,
presentation.
absolutely.
Thank you. So in this slide, Max presents the rate setting methodology used for HCBS. As you know, we do not currently explicitly incorporate the separate productivity component shown here. Next slide, please. In this particular slide, Max has carefully outlined the cost categories they consider essential for inclusion in the rates. And we're in agreement that these categories are indeed important. However, it's worth noting that although our approach to integrating costs may differ, our methodology comprehensively covers all the elements Max has highlighted. Next slide, please. Last year, DDA shared this slide at an RAG meeting illustrating the elements of our current wage model and the process of combining these elements to determine a rate. This approach encompasses all the cost categories outlined in the HCBS methodology, ensuring a comprehensive capture of costs. Next slide. As we just discussed, this slide is from a previous presentation to the RAG and provides a high-level summary of how rates are built. Next slide, please. This slide details Max's concerns about how the base wage is developed, specifically lack of an explicit adjustment to the BLS wage for productivity, concerns with the base wage trend assumptions, workforce challenges resulting from the geographic differential methodology, and lack of an adjustment for acuity when serving people with complex needs. Next slide. So in our efforts to create a comprehensive rate setting approach, we've successfully incorporated program support, general and administrative costs, training, and transportation within the billable unit, detailed on slide 12. This strategy aims to capture a broad spectrum of indirect expenses to address the challenge of not being able to directly factor in productivity adjustments. We've made a policy decision for applying higher wage assumptions than those reported by providers for what they pay to direct service workers. This approach is designed to assist providers in managing the additional costs associated with productivity, indirectly affecting the overall rate structure by elevating all related components to drive the final rate. Having said that, we acknowledge these strategies as temporary solutions and are keen on engaging with you for a more direct approach to handling productivity concerns. However, the success of such initiatives heavily relies on the availability and quality of data, with the full set of general ledger data from providers not expected until September. We're suggesting a targeted pilot focused on day habilitation services for the current rate cycle. This pilot's effectiveness will depend on robust data, which we currently lack, hence the call for your active involvement in gathering the necessary information from your networks. As previously discussed, the DDA has not made specific adjustments for productivity due to insufficient data at the time the BRIC methodology was introduced. We remain hopeful that the introduction of the new general ledger template will enable us to revisit and refine this aspect of our rate setting process. Your support in encouraging comprehensive and timely GL data submissions from your organizations and extended networks is crucial in this endeavor, laying the groundwork for improved methodologies and services. Next slide, please. So related to base wage trend assumptions, as mentioned before, we've deliberately set the base wage in the BRIC model higher to not only assist in covering provider costs, but also to serve as a target for potential wage growth, envisioning it as an aspirational wage. It's crucial to understand that the various elements within the BRIC model can differ from one provider to another, emphasizing that these components are not meant to dictate how providers should manage their operations. The rates we propose are based on averages and reflect broader policy choices. However, they don't necessarily correspond precisely to every individual provider's costs. For wage trends, we employ a combination of Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and legislatively mandated increases. This approach has been thoroughly discussed in previous RAG meetings, specifically when the legislature enacts a wage increase. We incorporate that directive into our model. In years without such legislative action, we rely on the CPI as the closest measure to adjust wages. Notably, the state sanctioned a 4% wage hike on July 1, 2023, and further expedited implementation of 4% increases scheduled for the following 2 fiscal years, cumulatively offering an 8% raise as of January 1, 2024. However, moving forward based on the feedback received from the RRAC during the last cycle, the state will only apply the CPI adjustment to the BLS wage moving forward for trending. Next slide, please. First, geographical differential. Our methodology has been refined over time, thanks to valuable input from both MAX and RRAG. We're fully aware of the significant variations across different regions. To address this, our rate development process considers the average Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, wages specific to these regions. While we strive for accuracy, we recognize that there may be instances where the actual costs incurred by providers in a particular region may not align perfectly with the set regional rates. But rest assured that we are committed to closely monitoring these discrepancies. And for acuity, as many of you are aware, we offer a range of services tailored to meet the diverse needs of individuals. This includes group services and personalized support options like 1-to-1 and 2-to-1, among others. For instance, as highlighted in slide 21, which you'll see here in a few minutes, residential services have varying rates to accommodate enhanced needs or specific requirements such as overnight supervision, along with additional supports like behavioral and or nursing services. DDA believes that our current strategy effectively considers the varying levels of need or acuity. However, if the RRAG sees value in further exploring acuity within our rate structure, we would greatly appreciate your guidance. Specifically, we're looking for insights on where adjustments might be necessary and what kind of data providers could contribute to support these analysis. That concludes the review of the MAX slides, and now we'll take a few questions. I'm sorry, open it up for discussion.
I think Chris wanted to.
Chris?
Yeah, can we pop back to slide 1, please? The DDA response to MAX slide 1.
Slide number 8, I believe that is.
Got one more forward. Yep, that one there. So Robert, just want to clarify, rebasing should be performed periodically. You had said 5 years. I was thinking we were at 3. I'm just trying to confirm which one that might be. So I really want to confirm periodically, that's all.
Yeah, so our next comprehensive review, Chris, is going to be for the FY27 rate, so that's about a 5-year. If you recall, when we started this process, it was FY22. I'm not defining what that will look like in the future. That will be up to Marlena and the secretary.
Are we committed to a minimum of 5 and maybe more frequently?
We certainly can take that into consideration, Chris.
Okay. My second question on that slide, and I'm, you're clear on the fact that the actuarial soundness piece is not required, that you don't necessarily have to follow that requirement, but it is good practice or best practice. And I guess I'm curious to see, I mean, we've got, actuaries at Hilltop, we've got actuaries at Optimus. What is the purpose to not involving them, or what is the reason to not involving them in the rate process?
So the reason that you have that requirement, right, for capitated rates is because providers are taking on some of that risk. As you know, they get a per member per month rate, and they're responsible for providing any service within the bounds of the contract, right, with the state. And enrollees need to the cost of managing the care for those enrollees need to be within those boundaries. So they they're taking on some risk for that. And in a fee-for-service model, providers are receiving a set fee for each specific service as it's delivered, and there's no risk sharing there. But having said that, again, we are more than confident that our rates are meeting or exceeding the standards that are set by CMS for setting HCPS rates.
Okay. And then I guess my last question, and really third bullet point there, adequate capture of costs, high quality data from at least 80% of providers is needed. I certainly feel like 80% is a achievable goal considering that it is mandatory. But can you kind of elaborate on what you mean by high quality? What does that benchmark look like? And, if Optimus is reviewing that data and, again, we punch out some highs and lows, got the anomalies go. If we're at 79, does that mean we're not using the data? What is kind of that review process to determine high quality, and then the subsequent process afterwards with respect to meeting that 80% threshold?
Sure. Is there a member of the Optimus team who would like to take that question?
Sure, Robert. This is Steve Schramm. Chris, the 80% is a benchmark. It is not a bright line. So if we had high quality data at 79.4%, we would have to review it. It's difficult to describe in a hypothetical situation what the threshold would be. When we came up with the 80%, what we were doing was setting a target where we were comfortable with what past variation has existed by provider, by service, and by geographic region, but it's going to vary depending upon what the particular service is. High quality information means that it's reasonable and it's consistent between and among the different providers and what we would expect. But again, without a particular specific issue, it's hard to describe what high quality is specifically.
Okay, I think, Steve, I appreciate that response. I think as long as we recognize that the data that we're going to get year one is probably not going to be as good a data as we get year two. I think a lot of CFOs right now are looking at the the GL data collection tool. They're restructuring GLs. I think when the rubber meets the road and we have to fill the form out, there's going to be some further adjustment probably on their part to achieve better data and better results and easier ability to fill the form out. As long as we, year one is still going to be key to us, but I think we've got to kind of take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. And I just want to make sure that maybe our threshold for what we consider high quality in year one may be different than year two.
Appreciate the feedback. We've tried to be flexible in the past, and we'll continue to work with DDA and Hilltop to provide training opportunities to help deal with the issues that the providers identify within their data sets, and in the spirit of utilizing as much information as the providers submit as possible.
This is Donna. Just a follow-up question. So for the 80% of providers, how do you assure capturing the costs for the services across the board? You know, a percentage of service costs, so it's not heavy on perhaps day community, or you look at the number of res providers you have across the state. How do you assure, you know, you're getting a good quality of data in terms of percentage from each of the service entities?
So Donna, that percentage would actually be specific to the particular service or rate that we're trying to set. So if it's, let's use the day habilitation pilot, we're asking the general ledger supplement be filled out by the day habilitation providers, and we're looking at getting at least 80% of the day habilitation providers in terms of volume of claims and members served.
Okay, that's good to know. So the 80% applies to the providers of that service for
Correct.
each. Okay, thank you.
I just have, this is Karen. I just have a quick question about high quality. I guess in defining what high quality data is, every time that I submit something, speaking for my personal organization, every time that I submit something, I deem it high quality data, that I'm submitting the absolute best data that I can submit. I'm not sure that I ever receive any feedback that my data is not high quality. So how are we communicating back to the provider community that the data that is being submitted is not the best quality? And what exactly do we need to submit to be sure that the data we're submitting can help drive the process?
If need be, this is Steve again. I can have Kristen from Hilltop talk about the technical assistance sessions. Karen, what we're talking about when we say high quality is that the data are submitted consistent with the instructions that are included as part of the general ledger and any associated supplement. What we've found in the past is that on occasion, providers will submit cost information in multiple categories. And so using your example, each data point that they've submitted, they would view as being a quality data point. But from our overarching perspective, when we've had follow-up conversations, the provider realized they were double counting some information, and that was inconsistent with the instructions. We have had conversations in the past with specific providers about concerns raised in looking at their data. And so we have utilized a feedback loop in some of the instances. We have not always had the time to do that, however, so I want to be clear, it is dependent upon the time available.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve, as a follow-up to your comment there, if you determine that data is not where it needs to be and you have that follow-up with the provider, are they allowed then to adjust and correct, and then it could be considered high quality, or is it kicked out from the minute it comes in?
No, we've used, Chris, good question. We've utilized information based on conversations with providers where as part of the follow-up conversation, they said, oh, you know what, I'm sorry, we misunderstood the instructions. And so we've utilized data based on conversations.
Okay. I would encourage too that the GL tool will be a somewhat of a living, breathing document as you get the feedback from providers where, you know, you start to see a pattern that nobody's understanding this, you know, this instruction, or it's not as clear as it needs to be, that we have the ability to adjust that. And then just the last point to that issue is, as we get closer to the September deadline, I would encourage DDA to consider some additional training if it's not already in place, maybe starting in June, as CFOs start to, you know, close out that fiscal year and start to, if they haven't already, I hope they all have, but if they haven't, to have that ability to get more training as that tool, as they're in the throw or in the midst of fixing and inputting the data into that tool.
That's very
Chris,
helpful.
Yeah, we appreciate the feedback, and Kristen and her team have been running already technical assistance sessions, and we'll have additional technical assistance sessions for the general ledger supplement. Kristen, I apologize, I cut you off.
Yeah, I'm going to keep us moving, Steve and Chris. And Chris, your points are well noted. I'm going to now turn it over to Marlena so that she can walk us through the FY 2026 rate priorities. Again, we'll have open discussion at the end, so if you didn't get to ask your question or provide input, you'll have another opportunity to do so.
And Steve, that was actually me just thanking Chris for that feedback. It's very helpful and something we are certainly open to doing. So when we talk about the next slide here in regard to our rate priorities, as you recall, the REG discussed the proposed rate priorities for the FY 2026 rate cycle during the January meeting, and the members voted to identify the top 3 priorities. They are employment supports, acuity, and productivity. Employment supports is grayed out on this slide here, given the fact that we are currently leveraging the National Expansion of Employment Opportunities Network, also known as NEON, the NEON grant, and we're waiting for outcomes and recommendations from the Employment First work group. The critical efforts of the Employment First work group are essential in driving policy changes that will be needed to be evaluated from a rate standpoint by Optimus, Hilltop, and this REG group. Essentially, modifications to policy will receive those throughout the support and analysis from a rate perspective within the REG process, which will ensure, that our recommendations and outcomes will be reviewed to determine if there's a rate component for consideration in a future rate cycle. Additional updates on acuity and a productivity factor adjustment will be discussed on the next few slides. Next slide, please. Updating the wages to the 2023 BLS data will reduce the amount of trending required. So please note that this may cause some BLS wages to be reduced in instances where the projections using the 2018 base resulted in higher rates than projections using the 2023 base. So it's anticipated that the 2023 BLS data will be available in early May for this analysis, and we'll provide updates. The productivity pilot for rehabilitation services offers providers the opportunity to submit actual wage data. So following the receipt of data and once we do our analysis, we'll provide recommendations at that time. Next slide, please. As we consider addressing acuity as a priority, it's important to note that we are already working to address acuity through specific services and policies. These include policies for assessing the needs of participants, providing enhanced services for participants with higher needs, and that would include overnight supports and overnight supervision for services, providing reimbursement built around dedicated support hours, and offering enhanced rates for some services. We'd like to discuss these services and policies in a little more depth. So as you all know, the DDA operated Medicaid waiver program provides individuals with different levels of acuity and needs, sometimes, which is what we're referring to as acuity. As a part of the person-centered planning process, the team uses that process and its planning tools, one being the health risk screening tool and other health and welfare assessments to determine the participants' assessed needs, level of services, and the participants' preferences. Our waiver programs also include enhanced residential and support services, overnight supports, and overnight supervision. In addition to dedicated supports, including 2-to-1 staff to participant supports, and enhanced rates when participants have a behavioral support plan or nursing care plan. Next slide, please. Now we'd like to go through your responses to our survey on acuity as a rate priority for this cycle. So what we received 5 responses, 5 RAG members responded. Most responses were general with limited details, and there were a few responses that just didn't address the request. So to share what those responses were, one respondent said that acuity was already incorporated into the rates via the methods we just discussed. 2 respondents suggested using tiered rates. Regarding what services should be considered for an acuity adjustment, respondents mentioned residential, meaningful day, and possibly employment and transportation. One respondent suggested using a standard assessment tool, something like the HRST or the supports intensity scale, or a behavioral health assessment combined with other criteria in our rate methodology. And then someone actually cautioned against using assessments as a rate tool. There was also a suggestion to modify the BRIC assumptions using the BLS wage, staffing ratios, and other components, as well as adding a productivity factor. For possible data sources, one respondent suggested a supplement to the general ledger template, but no one provided suggestions for specific data fields that would be needed for an analysis. Next slide, please. So as we discussed earlier, we're confident that we're already adequately accounting for acuity. We have these different services for individuals who have different levels of need. Again, we're talking about group services, dedicated hours, residential, and within residential, we have our different rate structures for enhanced levels of supports or additional costs for overnight supervision. And then we also have our additional services that are more germane to behavioral supports or nursing. We've also discussed on the previous slide that we address acuity through a number of our policies. One example is how we assign a higher percentile to certain BLS wages, such as community living group home, the enhanced wage there. As your partner in this effort, we're, again, I said this earlier, we're certainly amenable to looking at acuity in different ways, but we really need your help. We need your guidance on where and how potential adjustments to the rate structure might be made. We also need to know from you the specific services we should look at when you're talking about methodologies and what you recommend that methodology to be. And we also would need to know the specific data providers would need to give us to support the analyses. Again, we're just open to all possibilities, and we really want to look at all of them. So I want to ask, do you have any specific suggestions for defining a path forward that would include services we can look at, a methodology, data? Because it's just really important to note that without these critical factors, there's really not a good way we can reasonably address the concerns because we really want to understand your terms. So think about it. We'll share another opportunity for your input and constructive ideas following today's call. And we'll ask that all of that feedback be returned to us by March 21st. But we really want you to think about how we can address acuity in a manner that satisfies your concerns.
Okay.
Next slide.
Marlena, oh, I'm sorry, Robert. Can we just, on that slide 23, do you mind if I just real quick? I do think that some of that is a level of complexity and rate setting expertise that may go a little beyond
I won't speak for everybody on the RRAG, but I think some of that is really, kind of our actuarial consultant friends, particularly around data required. So I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of, how much you're looking for from RRAG members versus the expertise of Optimus and Hilltop around this, and also whether this could possibly be a, there's been discussion of subcommittees or little work groups of the RRAG, and I'm wondering if acuity might be a good topic for that kind of group.
So Laura, as you recall, I don't know if it was last rate cycle or rate cycle before, we stated that, obviously the state doesn't have the resources to run subgroups, especially during the RRAG cycle. But it's perfectly okay if members of the RRAG wanted to come together, form that subgroup, look at, what it is we're asking for and have those discussions, and then present those recommendations back to us. However, I would underscore that we really do need to have that feedback by March 21st in order to keep this process moving along and to mitigate the chances of this priority sliding into the next cycle. And as far as us trying to think about what data we would need or what services, keep in mind, we feel that we are addressing acuity in an effective way. So that's why it's really important that we hear from our provider community, identifying the services where they think there's gaps, identifying what data they currently have access to that they feel they could submit to us to help us make informed decisions moving forward.
Hey, Robert,
Okay.
This is Greg. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So you said exactly what was in my head in some ways, in that for us to try to resolve this in the next week is just not going to happen. But you made a statement about that the department feels like they have addressed that. I guess my question would be, we don't need to create a problem to solve it. If it's not a problem, it's not a problem. But how do you know if it is a problem? And I guess my question would be, is it the RRAG's responsibility to go out and try to find out who is struggling with this? Or is there some way that the department could kind of reach out, and you wouldn't be able to do it the next week, but over the course of the next several months to say, we think we've addressed this issue pretty well, but are there places where you as a provider are still finding that that's not the case? Because I can't speak for everybody else on the call. I can only speak for Penmar. But I think it would be good to not assume it's fixed, and then reach out and see, is this a widespread issue, or is this just isolated? And if it is isolated, you can address it in a very, very different way. So just a thought about how we would get that information out to providers. I think DDA has probably more resources to do that than the RRAG individual members trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important, Greg. We hyperlink a form that you see on the slide here for providers to do exactly that. What you just articulated very well. So I appreciate that. And we're going to pick on someone who hasn't had any input yet. New kid on the block, David. Anything that you want to add to the conversation?
Thank you, Robert. I'm soaking it in. I was just typing in the chat. I would note, just because you just referenced it, that the hyperlink which shows on the screen is not on the slide deck itself as the attachment. And I don't know what you're talking about in terms of this feedback forum, in part because I assume I wasn't invited to provide it prior to jumping on the RRAG. And I think your questions are fair ones. Frankly, I'm sort of with Greg as a general principle. I don't need to create or borrow trouble to create a solution. And so I'd have to dig just a little bit more deeply to understand Macomb's experience of rates and whether or not they're suitable to meet acuity or not. So I assume the next time we all meet, I'll be a little bit differently informed and prepared.
Thank you.
Robert, this is Karen. I appreciate you guys saying that you're confident that you are already meeting the acuity needs, but we do all know that there is no acuity adjustment for meaningful day services, and that does need to be looked at. And as everybody else has said, by March 21st, that date is extremely difficult for me just in my organization to figure out how to address all of those elements that you have identified. But I do think it's critical that we identify this information, because it does not exist for meaningful day.
Thank you, Karen. If you could, so we actually requested this information shortly after the last meeting. We didn't get enough information to inform a direction one way or the other. However, Meaningful Day was mentioned as one of those services that we need to look at. So I would just ask our Meaningful Day providers to kind of think of this from a data perspective, what we would need to look at to make informed decisions around acuity, but also if they have some any ideas on how they think we could address acuity and Meaningful Day services if they feel that there's gaps there. So appreciate your comments there. I'm going to keep us moving and turn it over to Kristen.
Can I add something? Can you hear me?
Yes, Karen Lee.
Okay. In a way, I do believe that we're putting the cart before the horse. We have asked that we look at some different rates specifically that are problematic and I think are not meeting the needs of people. And I think trying to solve for acuity before we fix the rates as the base of the rate, I think is premature. And you know, we operate multiple services, and the options as you've laid out, and I would even add way more than you have laid out, as the services that have acuity built into them, with the one-on-one, with the small group, with the personal supports, that and I happen to agree that the acuity is built into that. I wonder how much of it is the provider's model of service versus the actual rate is one question I would put out there. The second I would put out there is we have discussed for over a year now that we'll look at those employment rates, which I think are problematic and may take care of the acuity issue if we can look at those rates. So I feel like we need to take care of the business that we've said we're going to take care of for the last year and a half before we jump into trying to solve something that may take care of itself when we do the job that we had been asked to do originally.
Thank you for that feedback, Karen.
Robert, it's Chris. Two quick questions before you skip to the next section there. The acuity adjustment feedback form, is it open and available to all providers? Will we distribute them, or is it, because I think this is the first that we've seen, at least within the PowerPoint. And then second, the statement of failure to provide the feedback time will result in the priority being pushed to the next cycle. You know, we've already booted employment services, which Karen just brought up, to next year. We've got the productivity to discuss. If we punt acuity, then we're down to one of the three that the RRAG had recommended. I would suggest that that's the case to be looking 4 and 5. But before we go to that point, even if we don't have all the answers by March 21st, or potentially recognize that the solution may not occur this year, I don't think we should punt the entire priority to next cycle. I think we need to continue to discuss it. I don't want to sit next February, January, February, and we start the cycle over again. And it's the same, we're in the same position where we need a short time frame. I think it's something that's going to take some significant discussion, and would like to see, even if we don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle by March 21st, that the conversation continue this year.
Chris, to your point, we are going to be working based on what the RX set as priorities. We're working on these 3 that the RX set. So we are taking in the feedback. However, this membership voted on these top 3 priorities, and that's what we'll be focusing on during this review cycle.
So even if we don't have a solution or data by March 21st, it's still being discussed throughout the cycle here. That's the part I was confused on. Sorry.
Yes, that's correct, Chris. The March, so we're so used to when we tackle these priorities, coming to an informed data and a data informed decision as to how that will change the rate. So that's why that March 21st date is critical. If we slide from that, it doesn't mean we won't continue to discuss it to get there and build upon the work from this cycle and the next one. It just means that we're now don't have enough information to inform the 26 rates, and it would slide into the fiscal year 27 rates. So
we don't have a solution for it, that's all. But then my question to follow to that is then the same with employment. If we're waiting for feedback from another group, is there still value in discussing that now?
Yeah, so we have a meeting scheduled offline with Karen Lee. I know, Karen, that it's more related to the DSP career ladder, but we're also kind of going through some of the feedback we've already received from the employment first work group. As Marlena mentioned, that work is critical, as well as the NEON grant, which we're using to help crosswalk all of those recommendations with current policies and guidance, and to see how that's going to inform any policy changes which would have an impact on rates, and that will be shared with the RAG. So I'm going to keep us moving so that we don't run out of time here, and turn it over to Kristen, who will talk about the productivity adjustment. Next slide.
Thanks, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristen Deal at the Hilltop Institute, and I'm going to talk a little bit about productivity, which was identified as one of the top 3 for this rate cycle. So as mentioned earlier in our meeting, the DDA has committed to evaluating a productivity adjustment during this cycle. This slide helps to lay out some of the math behind a productivity factor. In simple terms, the base wage is increased by a productivity factor that captures time that is not billable. The existing BRIC model does capture the time spent on non-billable activity as part of the rate components, including employment-related expenses, training, general administration, along with the consideration of service closures. However, these components are currently constructed using the total wages and not the billable wages, which creates smaller values for the components. To compensate for that difference, historically, DDA has used a base wage that is assumed larger than the actual wage. Our goal is to collect the necessary data from providers so that we can add the productivity factor explicitly and increase transparency in our model. Next slide, please. In order to reduce risk to changing the methodology in the model, we will confine the initial investigation of using a productivity factor to the 4-day habilitation services. So this includes 2-to-1, 1-to-1, small and large group. So we'll be collecting data across all 4 of the services. This will allow DDA to test the data collection process and look at the impact to the model estimation and the rates without committing to a potential wholesale disruption of rates. We would like to collect the necessary data by sending all day hab providers a general ledger template supplement. It will contain all of the normal data points in the GL that was distributed last spring, and we will ask the DayHab providers to fill it out for the period capturing costs between July 1st of 2023 and December 31st of 2023. This supplement will include an additional table for each service tab that is not included in the previous release of the general ledger template that specifically asks about billable and non-billable time and wages by cost category. And additionally, we are hoping to collect information on service closures from the providers. If this data collection process is successful, then the supplemental data requested for the productivity factor will be considered for permanent inclusion in the general ledger template. Next slide, please. The DDA sent out a draft of the general ledger supplement to all day habilitation providers. I believe it went out this week on the 5th. We're asking for all providers to review that template and submit feedback back no later than March 14th. Feedback should be sent directly to the dedicated email at Hilltop, which was included in the communication that was distributed. DDA will release the final supplement immediately thereafter, and all day habilitation providers will have until May 1st to submit their data. 2 training sessions have been scheduled and will be hosted on March 21st and April 1st, and technical assistance will be available to all providers upon request. In order to be included in the pilot analysis, the templates must be submitted by May 1st. And as we've talked about before, it will be imperative to get complete data from 80+% of the providers who billed for day habilitation services in our study period to ensure that we have adequate representation of providers and regions.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask, are we only looking at the productivity for meaningful day? I would suggest that the productivity varies, or the indirect time varies per the service. So if you think about in a day habilitation center where there's less autonomy by frontline staff to because of the way the programs are set up, versus if you look at something like community development or learning services versus employment, that there is so much variability in the amount of direct and indirect time needed to do them. So if we take them differently, I think we would get different information from them.
Yes, Karen, that's a great point. The pilot is limited to just the 4-day habilitation services, so it's not inclusive of all meaningful day. We're targeting those 4 services to begin with.
Okay, and you won't extrapolate. You'll only use it for those 4 services.
Correct.
Thank you.
So this particular data collection is not mandatory, correct?
Yeah. So Donna, anytime we put out a tool,
Right.
it's mandatory. Right. Because
so
again, we have to have enough data so that it has the statistical significance to inform decisions.
I guess that's my comment, is wanting to make sure that day program providers do realize it is mandatory, so we do pull in enough of the data, because of 80%.
Thank you, Donna.
So I'm concerned about the 80%, and I certainly want all providers to respond, but I guess do you have the authority, given that this is not a, something like a cost report, and it's such a short turnaround time, to make it mandatory? You may not be able to answer that now. It's kind of a question I have. And again, I want everybody to complete it. Usually you need statutory authority of some type or regulatory authority to make something mandatory.
So we are working within our authority, Laura. I mean, this group has been at the table for some time trying to establish rates. We can't do it without the data. And I know you understand that. But we are working within in our authority, and it's only but so much we can get done in a year, right? So you'll see soon the work plan that we have in place, because it's a lot of work to do, not just on the provider side, not just on Hilltop side, not just on Optimus' side, but also the state side. And we're really here to try to get to a better place with providers who have expressed concerns about the rates. So we are working within our authority. We just really need everybody to come together to get the data we need to do so.
Right. I think we all want the same thing. I just this feels a little different than the the general ledger tool. So
Yeah.
This is Karen again. Can you, I know you said it earlier, but I think I missed it. Can you tell me what the 80%, what is that based on? And would, say you got 50% and it was top-notch data based on your benchmarks or your standards or however you assess quality, that you got 50%. We would then roll with that 50%, right? If we didn't have 80%. My assumption is the 80% is because you haven't been getting good quality data. But if you got good quality data from 50%, we would go with that. I'm just asking.
Optimus can answer, provide the same answer that they shared earlier, but we want something that's representative of the majority of the provider base. So Steve, would you like to speak to your earlier answer, please?
Sure. So what we had said was the 80% was based on looking at the amount of variability that exists in Maryland based on the size of providers, the type of services that they provide, and the geographic differential. We have made adjustments in the past using less than the 80%, and we've gotten significant pushback from the provider community that those adjustments may not be accurate. And so in our conversations with DDA, they asked us to come up with a number that we were comfortable with, and that's the origin of the 80% figure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to have a good cross-reference of the entire state, the different provider sizes, et cetera.
I understand that. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to move on because we are running short of time and we have quite a few slides to get through, and hope that we have some time for some public comment. So on this slide, the next slide, please. On this slide, I'm not going to read it to you, but this is just a representation of our work plan for this rate cycle that highlights key points and the timing to ensure that the rate priority analysis can be completed. Again, in order to have the best chance of success at piloting the productivity factor for this rate cycle, we need all of the DAHAP providers to complete the general ledger supplement template and return it to us by the deadline. That deadline is within the next 6 weeks. We understand that some providers would like more time for these data requests, but if we take longer to collect the data, we risk not allowing enough time for a comprehensive analysis and time to really address the rates for this review cycle. Robert?
Thank you. And Dr. Smalls, if you can jump to slide 29.
Robert, because I have one quick question on that slide. It's really quick. Under the RAG meeting timeline, third box down, the last bullet point says update on GL data collection process and opportunity for quarterly pre-submission. What does that mean?
Third box down, you said, oops.
Under the RAG meeting timeline column, third one down, third one, two, three, fourth bullet point, update on GL data collection process and opportunity for quarterly pre-submissions. It's the quarterly pre-submissions I'm curious about.
Robert, I can address that if you'd like, or Kristen can.
Yes, please, thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, Chris,
So
the slide is like an eye chart from where we're sitting, so.
we had, this is Steve Schramm again. We had talked at the end of last rate cycle that if any of the provider community wanted to pre-submit any of their GL templates and receive feedback from Hilltop, we would make that available.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And Robert, just one last thought, and I've said it a couple times over the last 2 years. I think we absolutely need a long-term strategic plan for data collection. And I got it. We are where we are. We've got to gather what we got to gather as quick as we can. But I think at some point, if we're able to stop or outside of this group, look at that mission or that plan, I think it's going to help this group. It's going to help DDA, and it's going to help the providers.
Thank you, Chris. We have 5 minutes remaining, and so I want to at least give the public and any members from the public an opportunity to chime in. Before we do that, I just want to remind the folks who are part of the public that we do have a form on the RAG page so that you can go in and fill that out ahead of time with your topic, etc. We did not receive any submissions for this month's meeting. However, we wanted to at least give the members within the next 5 minutes a chance to chime in. So if you want to, just raise your hand and Dr. Smalls will open up your mic. And Dr. Smalls, if you can let me know if no one raises their hand, then we can move on.
We did also get a few questions folks placed in the chat box. I can read those and then I can go through to see if we have any raised hands. The first question states, as a provider, I have received 2 emails reminding me to complete the GL template by September 2024. I received no notice of the GL productivity template request. Would you consider resending to the day providers with a header that this is a supplemental request?
Yes, and Kristen, you'll have to remind me, I think, did we send that out just to a subset of folks to provide feedback before we send it out to the broader community?
I believe it was shared with the identified day hub providers, but we certainly would want to hear from providers who didn't receive it to make sure we're inclusive of everyone.
Thank you. So yes, if that provider could just send an email to the email address that's in the slide deck, letting them know that they didn't receive it, then we'll make sure that they get it.
Okay, and I'm looking through our list and I'm not seeing any raised hands. I don't know if there are any other questions from our panelists, our members, or our public. You can go ahead and raise your hand. I'll unmute you. If you're a member of the panelist team, you can unmute your mic.
Raised my hand first and then unmuted. I'm trying to follow the bouncing ball. Unless it creates some sort of a workload crisis for us, Robert, if I can suggest, if I don't recall seeing that sort of subset data collection request. That doesn't mean I didn't get it. I just don't recall seeing it. And if it's easy enough to send out to the whole of the DayHab provider sort of community, unless it creates an undue workload, I'd suggest you just get it out there and highlight that it's a quick turnaround.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying skip the input process and just send it out as the final draft? And is that
No,
what?
yeah, no, that, I thought the comment from the provider I thought the provider's comment was, I don't remember seeing this survey for the DAHAB pieces of the general ledger. Maybe I misunderstood the question. I don't remember seeing it either. That doesn't mean we didn't get it. So if there's a survey out there that's asked DAHAB providers to provide a whole bunch of data that you want to use to assess or to use in productivity modeling, my suggestion is just get it out to the providers again to make sure that they have it and see it.
Thank you. We'll double check on that. I mean, we can easily resend it as well.
Robert, it's Chris. Were you saying that it went out to only a select few, or it went out to all day providers?
It went out to all DAHAB providers.
Okay, I've got several that text me that there's definitely an issue. Is it able to be posted on the website?
Yes, it is posted on the website. That's a good point, Chris. It is located on the RAG website. There is a landing page for all of our data collection tools, and that's where one can locate it. If I think we have some DDA folks who are on the call as well. Part of the panelists, if you could just go out to our website and snatch the link and paste it in the chat box for everyone, that would be great.
And we'll make certain to resend as well to all DAHAB providers.
And we'll send to our members. And I know that I saw just a little while ago that Maryland Works had also sent it to their members. So hopefully collectively we'll get to everybody.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. I will just add one thing. I received it, but I received it in my spam box, and I'm within the Maryland.gov, so that it might have been filtered by your spam filter, just FYI. All right, we're at the conclusion. I'm going to turn it over to our Deputy Secretary Marlena to close this out.
Next slide, please. So we're going to make certain that we get these materials republished again. Please make certain to check your spam inbox. In regard to our future meetings will occur monthly until August 2024 and will be posted on DDA's training calendar. Next slide.
Marlena, are they monthly or every 6 weeks?
Every 6 weeks. My apologies. We're pulling up the schedule here. Thank you, Laura. It's every 6 weeks. The schedule is here. The next meeting will be held April 18th from 12:30 to 1:45 p.m. Next slide. As we mentioned, all of the meeting materials will be made available through our designated DDA webpage for this advisory group. And we really, really thank you all for attending. We look forward to our continued discussion. We know that these timeframes may seem daunting, but we really need the data to make informed decisions to guide this process. And so we really appreciate your participation and partnership in this. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.